He was editor and publisher of Canada's equalism magazine, Every Man, a men's journal, for 12 years, and is the author of The Hand That Rocks the World, an inquiry into truth, power, and gender. His original models of gender codependence and psychological growth have formed the foundation of numerous self-discovery workshops and events. So please join me in welcoming David Shackleton.
Thank you, Janice. Can you hear me okay? So, I have always wanted to know why things are the way they are. And gender has just fascinated me. I didn't come into this in a way a lot of men do, from my life being turned around by something that happened to me. I came into it as a puzzle. And so I'm giving you a status report on my journey into solving this puzzle. So here's what I've got. Imagine this. Men and women are equal, fully and completely, and have been throughout history. There are several dimensions to this equality. Power and powerlessness, advantages and disadvantages, which I explore in my book, and which my friend Tim Goldich explores more explicitly in his book, Loving Men, Respecting Women, The Future of Gender Politics. Both are available for purchase here. In this presentation, I want to look at what we can call social contribution equality. The basic equality between men and women in their historical contribution to society. And then I'll look at how identity politics have denied this and other equalities and become dysfunctional. So feminists have told us that women have been oppressed, and that part of this oppression has been preventing them from contributing to society in ways that men have, as scientists, as engineers, explorers, pioneers, artists, authors, politicians, etc. This story has been repeated so often, and with such passion, that it feels true to most of us. But what if the specialization of men into positions of social power and provision of food and shelter was simply a gender role enforced by human biology, principally reproductive biology? What if women were constrained into domestic and child-raising roles simply because pregnancy and lactation kept them tied to children for the early child-raising years? And after that, the pattern was established and difficult to change. What if there was no patriarchal conspiracy against women, but simply biology is destiny? We spent 50 years looking at gender roles through a feminist lens and concluded that they represent male oppression of women. So let's take a look at them through a different lens. A lens that I call psychological archetype, and see what that shows us. People often trigger on the concept of gender archetypes, and I spent a chapter unpacking them in my book, but we don't have time for that here. So I'll say that both men and women have the potential to develop both the masculine and the feminine archetype. These are not the same as being male and female. They're psychological styles and inclinations that result from our history of gendered life roles. I want to just offer one basic idea for the purpose of this presentation. The highest value of the masculine archetype is the discovery of truth. Discovery of truth. The highest value of the feminine archetype is the creation of love. So, the masculine archetype's love of the discovery of truth has been behind men's historical achievements in science and technology, and the creation of civilization. It's important to realize this has not been the achievement of men in general, but of a smaller number of exceptional men who, through unusual ability, inclination, and effort, made the discoveries that now support our technical and civilizational abilities today. They discovered truth about the nature of the world, and we've all benefited from that. A tiny minority of women might have been involved here and there in this research, but it was almost entirely a male achievement. What we owe men for this is gratitude. Now, what were women doing during all of this history of male knowledge discovery? Principally, they were raising children and keeping house. Is there a parallel achievement from women during this time? One that stands equal to that of men? Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Let's move on here. With the slide? Okay, that's my books. I forgot all about that. Okay, this is the right slide. So, Lloyd Demoz is a social thinker who founded something called the the Institute for Psychohistory. Psychohistory is the study of psychological motivation in history. His book, The History of Childhood, identified 6 modes of child raising, each later mode more advanced than the ones that preceded it. And he showed that the advances in these child-raising modes were driven by what he called pioneering mothers. Mothers who, through their own exceptional ability and effort, loved their children more than they themselves were loved when they were children. So they advanced empathy in society. So Demoz attributes a steady advance in empathy within society over thousands of years, resulting in, among other things, the ending of slavery and our modern conception of human rights, entirely to the achievements of these pioneering mothers. Again, perhaps a few loving fathers played an important role. But this advance in social empathy has been driven almost entirely by women. It has been our steadily increasing ability to empathize with others based on how we ourselves were loved as children that has moved society forward in this important way. A way just as vital in scope and impact as the knowledge-based technology and science developed by men. In short, women have contributed just as much as men to our world, but in the realm of compassion, empathy, and love that has been their archetypal domain. This is a perfect example of Tim Goldich's contention that, what's the next slide? Can we go on? Yeah. This is a perfect example of Tim Goldich's contention that everything in gender is mirrors. There are equal and opposite things in gender that balance out but are different. So women have no need to feel resentful of men's achievements. Their own are just as magnificent. Note that Demoz doesn't just describe the relatively few exceptional mothers, parents who move society forward. The majority of his history of childhood describes the loveless, self-centered, and exploitive parenting that was typical of historical mothers, just as much of the history of male governance and authority was self-centered and oppressive. There really is no moral difference between the historical performance of men and women, but the overall trend, though slow, has been toward greater truth and greater love. So let us acknowledge this isn't so bad. Women and men are seen to be inherently equal and to have made equally important and equally difficult contributions to our modern world. And though history is fixed, the future is malleable. We can choose our path forward, including accepting women into men's realm of science and technology and governance, as we are doing, and men into women's realm of reproduction and child raising. We can share our worlds, and this is my personal vision of equality. Now, one could pull a mirror opposite trick on women to what feminists did when they named and shamed the patriarchy. Since women and women alone were responsible for the development of empathy in children, one could speculate that they intentionally conspired out of pure self-interest, to inculcate greater empathy for women than for men in their captive charges. The evident fact that both women and men empathize more deeply with women's pain than with men's could be attributed to an oppressive matriarchal conspiracy to privilege women at men's expense. So we get an exact mirror opposite charge to that of feminists who claim that men conspired to privilege men at women's expense. Let me say quite clearly, I don't believe in either of these stories. So, if the idea of a patriarchal male conspiracy to oppress women is false, why has it taken such strong hold of our culture? Why has it ruled our thinking for 50 years? In particular, what exactly happened in the 1960s when modern identity politics was born? Can you go to the next slide? As David Horowitz said some years ago, speaking of the 1968 student revolts, the surprising thing isn't that the young people rebelled. Young people always rebel. The surprising thing is that the adults gave in. Exactly. That was unprecedented. To understand why the adults gave in, and are still giving in 50 years later, we turn to Shelby Steele. Next slide. Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and author of several books, including White Guilt: How Blacks and Whites Together Destroyed the Promise of the Civil Rights Bureau. Mr. Steele has discovered the psychosocial roots of modern identity politics, the source of its power and the nature of its method. His insight applies to all identity politics, but he focuses his analysis mainly on race. I will quote from The New Segregation, which is an essay by Mr. Steele published in 1992. Race should not be a source of power or advantage or disadvantage for anyone in a free society. This was one of the most important lessons of the civil rights movement. The legislation it championed during the 1960s constituted a new Emancipation Proclamation. For the first time, segregation and discrimination were made illegal. Blacks began to enjoy a degree of freedom they'd never experienced before. End of quote. But then things went wrong. Steele recounts how black anger over years of injustice gave rise to a movement that was no longer about equality, but about special treatment. This is from Steele again. The Black Power movement encouraged a permanent state of rage and victimhood. An even greater failing was that it rejoined race and power, the very marriage that civil rights legislation had been designed to break up. The leaders of the original movement said, anytime you make race a source of power, you are going to guarantee suffering, misery, and inequity. Black Power leaders declared, we're going to have power because we're black. Well, is there any conceivable difference between black power and white power? When you demand power based on the color of your skin, aren't you saying that equality and justice are impossible? Somebody's going to be in, somebody's going to be out. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. Ultimately, black power is not about equality or justice. It was, as its name suggests, about power. And when blacks began to demand entitlements based on their race, feminists responded with enthusiasm. We've been oppressed too. Hispanics said, we're not going to let this bus pass us by. Eskimos and American Indians quickly hopped on the bandwagon, as did gays, lesbians, the disabled, and other self-defined minorities. By the 1970s, the marriage of race and power was once again firmly established. Equality was out, the politics of difference was in. From then on, everyone would rally around a single quality that makes them different from the white male, and pursue power based on that quality. It's a very simple formula. All you have to do is identify that quality, whatever it may be, with victimization. And victimization is itself, after all, a tremendous source of moral power. End of quote from Steele. He describes how this led to a shift in the entire politics of entitlement. Instead of claiming equal rights of citizenship under the Constitution, the original goal of the civil rights movement, blacks and other minorities began demanding entitlement solely based on their history of oppression, their race, their gender, their ethnicity, or whatever quality allegedly made them victims. By the 1980s, the politics of difference had in turn led to the establishment of grievance identities. These identities are not about such things as the great contributions of women throughout history or the rich culture of black Americans. To have a strong identity as a woman means that you are against the oppressive male patriarchy. To have a strong identity as a black means that you are against racist white America, period. You have no choice but to fulfill a carefully defined, politically correct role. You must document the grievance of your group, you must testify to its abiding and ongoing alienation, and you must support its sovereignty. As a black who fails any of these three requirements, you're not only politically incorrect, you're a traitor, an Uncle Tom. You're blaming the victim, you're letting whites off the hook, you're betraying your people. So, that's the end of quote from Steele. So Steele describes how these three, the marriage of race and power, the politics of difference, and grievance identities, are nurtured by colleges and universities. Colleges and universities are not only segregating their campuses, they're segregating learning. If only for the sake of historical accuracy, we should teach all students, black, white, female, male, about many broad and diverse cultures. But those with grievance identities use the multicultural approach as an all-out assault on the liberal arts curriculum and on Western culture. They've made our differences, rather than our common bonds, sacred. Often they do so in the name of building the self-esteem of minorities. But they're not going to build anyone's self-esteem by condemning our culture as the product of dead white males. We do share a common history and a common culture. And that must be the central premise of education. If we are to end this new segregation on campus and everywhere else that it exists, we need to recall the spirit of the original civil rights movement, which was dedicated to the self-evident truth that all are created equal. So, back to the psychosocial thinking for a moment. Why did white guilt, as to use Steele's phrase, grow so large in the 60s that the establishment became unable to withstand against groups employing victim rhetoric? Mr. Steele suggests that the message of black leaders like Martin Luther King was proven by visible racism on TV, that new technology in the 60s of social perception and persuasion, as peaceful black protest marches were assaulted by redneck white racists on the nightly news. In short, racism became too overt to deny. In a later book, he adds other possible factors. The Vietnam War showed that the establishment was lying to Americans, playing politics with young men's lives. Environmental pollution was made visible by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And feminism added the charge of widespread sexism to that of racism. Altogether, it was a devastating indictment of the establishment, named and perceived as a white male institution. So, Mr. Steele has a comprehensive picture here, but I think he misses some things, which is the world events in the lived experience of those college presidents and other establishment leaders in the 50 years prior to the 1960s. In that time, the world saw two unprecedented world wars with death tolls in the millions. The devastation of nuclear destruction from atom bombs dropped on Japan. The horrors of the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews were exterminated in death camps. And the Great Depression of 1929, when millions were thrust into poverty through the greed and mismanagement of establishment financiers. All of these must, in the 1960s, have seemed to represent truly disastrous mismanagement in the spheres of governance, international relations, economics, and science and technology, all acknowledged as white male responsibilities. So when the charges of racism, sexism, materialism, environmental pollution arose and were seen to be credible, it was too much. The establishment could no longer believe in itself. Its moral authority evaporated, and college presidents caved in to student radicals all over the Western world. So that's what happened in the 60s that I think was unique, a unique event in our history. What kind of politics result from being fueled by guilt? Because the guilt is the source of power, it must be employed in every political claim. And so every claim is built on grievance, a claim to victimhood. But that's not the worst. Worst is that it is at root hypocritical, founded upon lies that cannot be avoided. The political rhetoric is a demand for equality, but the subtext is always the moral inequality of the innocent indicting the guilty. The subtext is moral superiority. The demand is for respect, but the stance is disrespectful. And the equality that is demanded can never be achieved, must always be just out of reach, or the guilt game is over. As Shelby Steele observed of the Black Power movement, the real purpose of modern identity politics isn't justice or equality, it's power. So let me speak plainly about this. What we're seeing here is a massive psychosocial dysfunction in our society. In my book, I explored this dynamic in detail and discovered that it operates like the model of codependence discovered by the addiction recovery movement. But for now, let us simply recognize that it is inherently unhealthy and hypocritical. Where the racial politics of the 50s and early 60s, led primarily by Dr. Martin Luther King, were politics of principle and vision based on mutual respect, seeking equality of opportunity, what emerged in 1968, the year he was assassinated, were the dysfunctional politics of guilt projection. And those politics haven't changed in 50 years. Why haven't they changed? Why is the establishment still vulnerable to claims of this systemic racism and sexism? Why hasn't 50 years of appeasement let us off the hook? Somehow the guilt projection still finds its target, still intimidates and manipulates almost all of us, including those in powerful positions. Our psychosocial recovery still eludes us. What is to be done? I don't want to leave such a description of a chronic international dysfunction without some discussion of solutions. But first we have to note that the emotional energy, the emotional momentum of this process is huge. A lot of people are heavily invested in it and highly resistant to any suggestion that it's inappropriate. Any criticism of the processes of identity politics is instantly stigmatized as motivated by racism or sexism, an attempt to undermine the equality gains won by blacks or women. It's important to realize that codependent dysfunctions are feeling driven. They feel right. Indeed, they feel satisfyingly righteous to those who drive them forward. Since these dysfunctions are distortions and perversions of what is true, they are vulnerable to truth spoken with power and clarity. However, be aware, they are also virulent in defending themselves, and they have powerful weapons of social shaming, stigmatization, and exclusion at their disposal. But it was ever thus. Those who stand against tyranny always do so at some personal risk. My own insight is that this psychosocial dysfunction is best understood as an addictive phenomenon, which suggests that the 12-step processes developed by the addiction recovery movement might be of some use. Exactly how this could be made practical, I don't yet know. So to conclude, as we work to understand and heal this modern social dysfunction, let's be aware that it only works because white men are basically good, responsible people. The attribution of white guilt works only because the white male establishment in the 60s and still today isn't composed of the greedy, self-interested, patriarchal exploiters that it is labeled. A guilt trip wouldn't work on such people. Why would they care? The attribution of guilt only works because white men are good, honestly willing to hold themselves accountable and to feel contrition for past and claimed present racism and sexism. So in this presentation, I've offered a glimpse of the psychosocial power dynamics operating below the surface of modern society. Discerning the nature of these patterns has been and remains my life's passion. I hope this glimpse has been intriguing to you as well, and if you have ideas about how to move this work forward, please share them with me. Thank you.
David, thank you for saying that among the things that I would like to have is gratitude. It is all too rare. Something else which is even rarer is respect. However, I would like to make an additional point. Feminists claim that men and women were equal. Well, first they insisted men and women were physically equal. Women do not have the stamina or endurance of men, as we can see from all organized sports and the Olympics. That's why sports are sex segregated, because if they weren't, all the gold medals would go to men, and silver and bronze. But there's another issue. The presumption of intellectual equality between women and men is incorrect. Women and men, and I have the data in my report, which anyone is welcome to a copy of, men have dominated and created all culture for the past 2,700 years, as early as human beings could write. All of the data in the SAT, GRE, LSAT, MSAT tests show a significant separation between men and women, and that is among the very select group of those who apply to universities. Claiming that women and men are intellectually equal leads to quotas, leads to the problems that Janice Fiorino has pointed out in universities, in which there are literally quota hiring and graduating programs for women. STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and math, have so far resisted this. But I'll tell you who will resist it: Asia. China will resist it, South Korea will resist it, Japan will resist it, but we won't. And for the West, this is trouble. Big trouble. If you'd like to see my report, if you're comfortable with statistics, and I got lots of them, you're welcome to it. I have a few copies. Thank you.
You know, there have been a lot of intelligence studies, and they do vary in their results. It seems that the races have different averages and intelligences. They differ not by very much, but they differ. But I don't see really any value in exploring that. I can't see any positive result from talking about that. My belief is that we are, we don't make a distinction between a more intelligent and a less intelligent person in terms of their status and equality, and nor should we. So I think that the vision of equality that I named, where we say to men, share your world with women, and we say to women, share your world with men, is the way to go forward. And talk about different abilities. I think evolution always selects for the job that a person ends up doing, and gender roles have selected. And if men have been selected to have a slightly higher intelligence, and women have been selected to have a greater empathy, so be it. I don't know. My vision of equality says it doesn't matter so much, because if we take away the barriers to men and women, and let them do what they wish and strive for what they want to work at, that's the way forward. So I don't really see the relevance of those kinds of explorations, Jeffrey. Thank you.
Last question. I wanted to say I have a hunch, and it's entirely unfounded, but I think, and we've talked about this a little bit, that I think some of the rage, some of feminist rage and its determination, feminism's determination to find ever more evidence of discrimination, even if it's fantastical, comes from the refusal to recognize that there might be actual intellectual differences between men and women. So I think that it is perhaps necessary to deal with that in some way, because if you begin from the premise that there is no difference, and then you move to equality of access, but you don't get equality of outcome, then there is always a reason for the rage. And then you have social programs that come in that say we've got to mandate equality of access, since there clearly cannot be equality. We have to mandate equality of outcome, because clearly we're not having equality of access if there is indeed equality to begin with. And so I think actually acknowledging that truth, if it is indeed a truth, is pretty important in charting the way forward. But anyway, what the question I wanted to ask is, I was very intrigued by your analogy of the psychosocial mechanisms that are going on now around white male guilt in particular, seeing that as a kind of addiction, the charge, of oppressiveness. Now you said that if we think of it in terms of an addiction, and we think of 12-step programs towards healing as a way forward, that there might be some parallels there on a social level, but as the little I understand about healing from addiction is that one has to first acknowledge the addiction, and often one has to hit rock bottom first, right, before one acknowledges that. So does that say anything about what the future is going to look like if we need to hit rock bottom first before we're able to acknowledge the addiction? Is there a way to acknowledge it before we hit rock bottom?
I certainly hope so, Janice. I don't know if there is, but hitting rock bottom, skid row if you like, in alcoholic terms, is only one way. There are other ways that people enter. There's something called an intervention, which, if done by a family, a loving family, can sometimes turn a person around before they hit rock bottom. I don't know how such processes could start, but I know that for the Alcoholic Anonymous movement, which basically started this whole thing about 80 years ago, it was two self-confessed drunks who had an idea about how to work with alcoholics. And the essence of their idea was to recognize that it wasn't a moral failing, a lack of discipline, but a disease. So they moved the notion of alcoholism from moral failure, from a moral world into a health world. And so the notion of shaming went away, right? And I think that might be powerful in our thinking about gender, is if we can take this story that we have, which is a very moral story about oppression and how what men have done has been so wrong, and move it into a health thing, which is simply talking about dysfunction, which is what I'd be doing here, right? And psychosocial dysfunction, which we can characterize as a health issue rather than a moral failing. That might be a way forward. To go back to your first point about do we have to acknowledge inequalities? I don't know. I think we need to tell the truth to ourselves. If we want to look at, it's not just, you're right, it's not just in the physical realm that men would win all the gold medals if it was, the mixed gender Olympics, it's like the top woman chess player in the world is ranked 70 among all of the men, right? So I don't know what that means, but in the end I don't really care, because I think what we want it to offer is equality of opportunity, and it'll work itself out. So the question is, can we accept that equality of opportunity will result in unequal outcome? That's the key thing, and I think we can. I mean, we accept that among employees in a company, that some rise to the top and some don't. Can we do it for gender? Why not?
You asked one question about why does this guilt shaming keep on going, and why haven't we had success with the, if we were understanding what was going on and we tried to fix it, why is it still going on? And I think one of the problems is that it's either an additional dimension or something that's a little bit deeper. I've been studying and learning different things about personality disorders and the impacts on communication and things like that, and I'm learning that basically when you have one person who is convinced that they are the victim and they're hysterical and they're arguing with a person who is playing the role that you presented as, you know, the person who gives the other the benefit of the doubt and who walks into the trap of guilt shaming and shame tripping, whatever you want to call it. The objective, if the person is in an irrational state of emotion, their objective is not the words that they're using. They can use whatever words they want, but they want to transfer their pain. They want to transfer their shame, their guilt to whoever's in front of them, and they'll use any words for it. And even as we listen to them speak, sometimes irrationally, we don't understand what they're trying to say. They confuse us, and it only keeps on going and going and going, and we're not getting anywhere. So at a moment in time when we realize that the goal is not really what's stated as the goal, that's when we can walk away. But everybody in normal circumstances never gets taught about mental health. And I'm not talking about mental disease, I'm talking about mental health. And the fact that our mental health is not at 100% or at 50%, it's all over the place. For everybody has a mental health. And the fact that it works to guilt trip somebody else is the reason it keeps going on, because we're all of the people who are basically good and are either people pleasers or whatever, we're bait for these people. We really are, because we give them the benefit of the doubt, so they instantly win. They drag us where they want, and it'll keep going because it works.
I think what you're talking about is what I'm trying to get at by suggesting that the basic phenomenon is an addictive process.
With shame at the bottom.
Well, yes, and so what is the addiction? Well, the addiction for the one who is projecting the guilt is an addiction to innocence, right? Because it hurts too much to be guilty. I've got to get it out there. I've got to get you're the one. For men, it's a bit more complicated, because I think what we're addicted to is, in general, right? I'm talking not about individuals here, but psychosocial patterns, is prowess and accomplishment and competence. And so we might be guilty, but at least we were powerful. And so, I think that there's a codependent pattern going on, right? And that's what I hope we can start to deal with.
Thank you.
I hope I'm not repeating too much that's already been said, but so we've got people who subscribe to identity politics who are using guilt and shaming as a lever to try to force some things to happen.
Yes.
But it seems that they just keep on making more, pushing for more and more and more with no real end in sight. What do you suppose could be an end point for this mindset, is there ever going to be a stage where those who act on the basis of this mindset will ever be satisfied and happy with what they've done, and then declare that they're done and then go home?
Well, the addictive, you might recall I asked Karen Straughan a similar question when she made her presentation, but is there a way out of this? I don't know. As Janice alluded to, the end point of the addictive process is, total failure, is skid row. I hope there are ways out of that. I'm not sure that I can spot any yet, but I'm looking, right? So yeah, that's part of my search. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ann.
Okay, hi. Just wanted to ask, okay, hi, I'm Donald Trump. I'm running for President of the United States, and white male Americans, you've been guilted, you've been, hammered down, and, I'm going to build a wall in Mexico, and I'm going to, anyways, do you think Donald Trump's going to win president? Like his whole message is geared to white American males. They've been punched down and beaten down and knocked down and guilted. Okay, so that's my question. And is he like an example of identity politics? And some of the things you're talking about here, Donald Trump, he's running for president. Gosh, the nightmare is I'm going to wake up and the guy's won. He's become president. And he's won, and he's got this end game. He's got this kind of scheme, plan. It's going to work. Shit,
I think Donald Trump and Hillary are actually examples of identity politics, let's say it's that, but in an interesting way. I think that what's happening with Donald Trump is that for all of this time that I've been talking about, 50 years, what we can call the right, the conservative side of the political spectrum, have known that there's something wrong going on, but haven't felt able to stand against the shaming. So they've been frustrated by political correctness, where the left has kind of bought into it in a way and felt like it's the right thing. But the right has known that there's something wrong, but hasn't felt strong enough to stand up to it. And so there's been a growing frustration. And I think Donald Trump has tapped into that. He's somebody who stands up and says, look at me, I'm not intimidated by this. And I think that the conservative, he's coming from that part of the spectrum, political spectrum, right? That's who he's representing. They feel so frustrated with identity politics and the social shaming and so on that they're just hungry for anybody who can stand up to it. So I think that's where Donald Trump is getting his energy from. It's from the frustration at identity politics in the political right. So, and I think it's very unfortunate. It's not a healthy place for a political candidate to be getting their support from. Because it's not very balanced. It's not very healthy. I think I've got to stop. I'm looking at the time, and there's only another 10 minutes until the next session. So, thank you very much.